The snow fell gently over the city that night, softening the sound of traffic and painting every rooftop in hushed white. Beneath a flickering street lamp on the corner of 56th and Madison, Henry Morris stood with his shoulders hunched, hands buried deep in his worn jeans, and a folder clutched tight against his chest. Inside were 5 resumes, each one marked by a quiet rejection, as if the world had already decided to forget him. Once a proud structural engineer, a husband, a father, now just a man with tired shoes standing in the cold, waiting for a bus that always seemed late. The wind cut through the holes in his jacket like needles, but Henry said nothing. He had grown used to discomfort. Then, through the swirling snow, she appeared, a woman no older than his daughter might have been, dressed sharply in a business skirt, blouse and heels, but shivering with every breath. No coat, no umbrella, just arms wrapped tight around herself as if bracing against the world. Henry glanced at her once, then looked away. But something in her trembling hands stirred something in him. And in a moment that would quietly alter the course of 2 lives, Henry did something simple. He took off his coat. The elevator doors closed behind Claire Langford with a soft chime as she stepped into the stillness of her penthouse. City lights glittered far below, but inside the silence was heavy. She set her purse down with the jacket still draped around her shoulders like a memory she couldn't shake. It didn't belong here, not in this glass palace filled with sleek furniture, curated art, and muted tones. It was too worn, too real. She was about to hang it by the door when something in the lining caught her attention. A crumpled edge of paper peeked out from the inner pocket. Curious, she reached in, fingers brushing against something delicate, and gently pulled it free. It was a drawing, a child's drawing, the kind done with crayons and love. 2 stick figures stood hand in hand under a crooked yellow sun. One was labeled Dad, the other me. A red heart floated between them. In shaky, innocent handwriting it read, "I love you, Daddy, Noah." Claire stared. Time slowed. Her breath caught. The jacket slipped from her fingers, pulling at her feet like the weight of a memory too deep to hold standing. She sat down on the edge of her pristine white sofa and stared at the drawing, her throat tightening with a sudden rush of emotion she hadn't let herself feel in years. Noah. The way Henry had held that folder, the silence behind his smile, the kind of stillness in his eyes that only came from carrying something heavy for far too long. It all made sense now. This wasn't just a man who offered a coat. This was a father. A man still holding on to a child's love as if it were the last warm thing in his world. Claire looked around her apartment. Designer fixtures, clean lines, no clutter, no mess, and not a single photo on the walls. She leaned forward, gently placing the drawing on the coffee table, her hands trembling. For years she had walked these rooms like a queen in her tower, successful, admired, respected, but now she felt hollow. She remembered something, no, someone. A girl not so different from the man she'd met tonight. A girl once left in the cold too. A girl who had once been wrapped in kindness and who had promised never to forget. But she had, until now. The drawing sat on Claire's nightstand like a whisper she couldn't unhear. She couldn't sleep. The city lay sprawled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse, but her thoughts were far from skylines and spreadsheets. She walked barefoot to the window, the cold glass beneath her palm grounding her as memories she had buried deep came rushing back like a tide breaking through years of silence. She had once been that child, cold, alone, forgotten. She could still remember that bitter winter night when her foster mother had locked the door behind her. She had wandered the city streets in a threadbare sweater, her feet aching, her hands numb. And then, a miracle. An old man, she never knew his name, had seen her shivering on the steps of St. Matthew's Church. Without a word, he had unbuttoned his coat and wrapped it around her. It was heavy, smelled of pipe smoke and rain, and it was the first time she had felt warm in days. He had only said, "You'll be all right, little one." And she was. That single moment had become the root of everything she built. From a girl sleeping in shelters to a woman who built Infinity Group, a tech empire known for disruption and dominance. But in chasing power, she had lost the softness. She had forgotten the coat, the kindness, the miracle, until now. She turned away from the window and walked toward her desk, pulled out a silver bell, and rang it once. Moments later, Rachel, her assistant, stepped in. Yes, Ms. Langford? Claire didn't hesitate. I need to find someone. Rachel blinked. Who? Claire picked up the drawing, holding it like something sacred. His name is Henry. I don't know his last name. I met him at the 56th and Madison bus stop last night. He gave me this jacket and everything in it. She paused, then added softly, I need to find him. Rachel nodded slowly. Of course. I'll start immediately. Claire looked back out at the skyline. This isn't a task. It's personal. Please, don't treat it like a file. And for the first time in years, her voice broke. Rachel worked in quiet urgency, the way only someone trusted with a secret mission would. Her team, usually skilled at hunting down elusive coders or head-hunting billion-dollar CEOs, was now focused on something far more human. Finding a man who had given away his only code. Claire sat at her desk, her mind elsewhere, as snow continued to fall against the window. Her eyes wandered back to the child's crayon drawing, now gently framed in silver and sitting beside her coffee mug. She hadn't told Rachel about the drawing. That was hers, too sacred to explain. The next afternoon, Rachel stepped into her office holding a thin folder. Her expression was unreadable. His name is Henry Miles, she said, carefully placing the folder on the desk. Claire opened it. There, staring back at her, was a photo. Buffalo, Henry's old driver's license. He looked younger in the picture, but the tired kindness in his eyes was the same. The folder also held fragments of a life that had once been whole, a structural engineer's license, faded work records, a handful of online forum posts asking about job openings, and then silence. No permanent address, Rachel added, but we traced a prepaid phone number to a call made last week near a warehouse in the Bronx. Claire's heart tightened. We think he's living out of a truck behind it. One of our people spotted him yesterday. Claire stood. I want to go there. Rachel blinked. We could bring him here. No, Claire said quietly. I need to see where he is. With my own eyes. An hour later, a black sedan pulled up near a warehouse tucked deep in the South Bronx. It was quiet, the kind of forgotten part of the city where streetlights flickered and silence pressed heavy against the wind. Then she saw it, an old, rusted pickup truck. Parked behind the warehouse, half buried in snow, its windows fogged, the tires tired, but somehow still standing. She stepped out of the car into the bitter cold, the jacket she wore feeling heavier than ever. As she approached the truck, the driver's side door creaked open. Henry stepped out slowly, blinking against the afternoon sun. It took him a second. Then recognition dawned across his face, mingled with something like disbelief, and then shame. He looked down at his scuffed boots, his wrinkled shirt, the makeshift home behind him. Claire, he said, voice rough from sleep and surprise. She smiled gently. Hi, Henry. What are you doing here? She took a breath, her voice quieter than she expected. I came to find you. He crossed his arms, trying to make himself smaller. You shouldn't have. She stepped closer. Why? He looked away. Because I'm not worth finding. She shook her head. You gave me your only coat on the coldest night of the year. I think that's worth something. He gave a tired, bitter laugh. People do things in the moment. Doesn't mean they matter. It mattered to me, she said, voice trembling. And for the first time since he'd given her that coat, Henry Miles believed that maybe, just maybe, what he did hadn't disappeared into the cold. 3 days after Claire found Henry behind that warehouse, she stood in the marble lobby of Infinity Group's headquarters, waiting. Henry stepped inside, wearing his cleanest shirt, his shoulders squared but uncertain. The automatic doors closed behind him with a soft swoosh, as if the building itself were swallowing his disbelief. He glanced around, glass, chrome, expensive light fixtures that hummed softly. It felt like stepping into another universe. Claire approached him gently. You came, she said, warmth in her voice. You asked, he replied, still not sure why. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she led him to a quiet elevator, then up to a private floor with sweeping views of the city. The conference room they entered was glass-walled and bathed in morning sunlight. Henry hesitated before sitting. The suit he wore had been borrowed, slightly too big, the cuffs of his shirt fraying at the wrists. He was keenly aware of every thread, every wrinkle. Claire sat across from him and slid a folder toward him. "What's this?" he asked. "A job offer," she said simply. He opened it, brow furrowing as he skimmed the first few lines. "Cultural and Human Values Advisor? You'd work with department heads," she explained. "Sit in on leadership meetings, not for strategy or numbers, but to remind us what matters. People, stories, compassion." Henry blinked. "Why me?" She leaned in, her voice softer. "Because you changed me, Henry. You reminded me that kindness is the seed of everything worthwhile. This company, it needs your kind of leadership." Henry laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "I live in a truck." "You lived," Claire corrected, "and you gave when you had nothing." He looked at the contract again, overwhelmed. "I don't have credentials for this." "You don't need credentials to teach people how to care," she said gently. "You live it every day." The words sat between them like fragile glass. Henry stared at them, at her, then down at his hands, scarred from years of work and weather. Claire reached over and rested hers on top of his. "Don't say no," she said, "not yet. Just consider that maybe this world needs more people like you in boardrooms." Henry didn't respond, not with words, but for the first time in a long time, the silence wasn't hopeless. It was possibility. The first day Henry stepped into Infinity Group as an employee, he felt like an imposter walking through a dream. There were no cameras, no confetti, just a quiet nod from the receptionist and a small laminated badge that read, "Henry Miles, Human Values Advisor." He took the elevator alone. Upstairs, they'd given him a small office, modest by company standards but bright, with a window that looked out over the east side of the city. Someone had already placed a potted plant on his desk and a coffee mug that said, "Be kind, always." He smiled at that. The first few days were awkward. Department heads didn't quite know what to make of him. Some kept their distance, unsure of his role. Others gave polite smiles and sidelong glances, wondering how a man with no MBA and worn-out shoes had landed such a unique position. Henry didn't try to impress. He just showed up. He listened more than he spoke. He sat in meetings, asked questions like, "What would this decision look like if your mother worked in this department?" Or "How do we talk to employees who don't feel safe to speak up?" He never preached. He asked. And slowly things began to change. Break room conversations grew warmer. A stressed intern left a thank you note on his desk. Employees who once walked past each other in silence now shared stories over lunch. People started remembering the janitor's name, greeting him every morning. Henry never led with his title. He led with presence. At night, he still returned to the old truck. Not out of necessity now, but out of habit. A comfort in the familiar. But after a week, Claire handed him a set of keys. "I found a place," she said, "and I want you to see it." It was a modest one-bedroom home on the edge of Brooklyn. It had creaky floors, an overgrown garden, and a porch with peeling paint. But it was his, and it had space for one more. A week later, with the ink barely dry on the deed, Henry stood on that same porch, watching as a cab pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and a young man stepped out. Noah. He was taller now, sharper features, leaner frame. But the moment their eyes met, Henry saw him. Not the years lost, not the pain, but his son. Noah hesitated, then ran up the steps and pulled his father into a tight, silent hug. "You kept your promise," he whispered. Henry couldn't answer. He just held on tighter. That night, they ate spaghetti and garlic bread at the tiny kitchen table. No fine china, no music, just laughter, just warmth. And when Noah said, "But it's good to have a home again," Henry smiled and said, "We're just getting started." It didn't happen overnight. There was no grand gesture, no slow-motion kiss under the stars, no swelling music to mark the moment Claire and Henry became more than just colleagues, more than just friends. It happened in the quiet in-between, over coffee cups, laughter in the hallways, in conversations that stretched past office hours. Claire began visiting Henry's little office more often, sometimes with questions, sometimes with nothing at all. "Got a minute?" she'd ask, already halfway through the door. Henry would smile. Always. She'd sit across from him, usually in her heels and perfectly pressed blazer, and yet somehow she never looked out of place next to his worn flannel and old steel-toed boots. They talked about people, about choices, about everything that happened between sunup and sundown. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. One rainy Tuesday, Claire brought 2 cups of coffee to his desk and sat across from him, staring out the window at the gray sky. "Do you ever wonder," she asked quietly, "if the strongest things are the ones we never plan for?" Henry didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, the tension in her shoulders, the way she wrapped both hands around her mug, her hair falling loosely over one eye. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the things we don't plan for are the ones that save us." She looked up then, and their eyes met, not the kind of glance that darts away, but the kind that holds steady, searching for something unspoken. Neither of them moved, but in that stillness, something shifted. After work, their walks to the subway became routine. Their weekend coffees turned into shared books, inside jokes, and meals at the little diner Henry loved on Flatbush. Claire would sit across from him, her blouse still crisp from the day, laughing at the way he sassed the waitress. And he would look at her not as the CEO of a tech empire, but as the girl who had once been given a coat in the cold and had never forgotten the warmth. One night, after a quiet dinner in her apartment, she poured him a second glass of wine and asked, "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't met?" Henry leaned back, thoughtful. "I try not to think about what didn't happen. Life's too short for that. But still," she said, her voice quieter, "it's strange, isn't it? How something so small, a coat, could change everything." He looked at her then, his voice rough, steady. "It wasn't just a coat, it was hope. For both of us." She smiled, and it wasn't the polished boardroom smile she wore in meetings. It was the soft, honest kind that lingered at the corners of her eyes. They sat in silence a while longer, the city buzzing faintly outside the tall windows. And then Claire reached out, not dramatic, not rushed, just a hand resting on his. "I don't know what this is," she said, "but it feels like something real." Henry turned his hand over, laced their fingers together. "It is." On the 5th floor of Infinity Group, nestled between the Product Innovation Wing and the Talent Development Hub, sat a small, glass-walled room that didn't quite match the rest of the office. No sleek desks, no fluorescent buzz, just warm lamps, soft chairs, and the scent of old books and fresh coffee. This was Henry's space. And more than that, it had become the beating heart of the company. It started with a curious intern who wandered in one afternoon, unsure of where else to go. She was overwhelmed, afraid of making a mistake that might ruin her career before it even began. Henry didn't offer advice. He just listened. When she cried, he handed her a napkin. When she doubted herself, he offered a story about a time he dropped a steel beam on his foot and still showed up for work the next day. "You're not here to be perfect," he said gently. "You're here to grow." Word spread quickly. At first it was the new hires, then the mid-level managers, then even the department heads, people who had spent years pretending they were fine until someone finally asked if they weren't. They came to Henry not because of his title or his experience, but because he made them feel seen. He didn't solve their problems. He reminded them they weren't alone in them. One afternoon, a young programmer sat across from him, eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights and anxiety. "I think I'm burning out," the young man whispered, voice cracking. "I feel like if I stop for even a second, I'll be replaced." Henry leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. "You ever try to hold your breath underwater?" The programmer blinked. "At first you're fine," Henry continued. "Then your chest tightens, your head pounds, but you stay under, thinking you've got something to prove, until finally you come up gasping and everything feels sharp and terrifying." The young man nodded slowly. Henry smiled. "You're not weak for needing air, son. You're human." That line, the one about needing air, was scribbled onto Post-it notes and passed around like gospel. It made its way onto office doors, Slack channels, even company newsletters. And with every passing week, the culture of the company began to change. Meetings started with check-ins, not just updates. Managers began asking not only what their teams had done, but how they were feeling doing it. And in the middle of it all was Henry, not preaching, not commanding, just being present, just showing up. Because somewhere along the way, Henry Miles, once a man sleeping in his truck behind a warehouse, had become something else entirely. He was a lighthouse, and for the reputable, the tired, and the quietly breaking, he was the signal that said, "You're not invisible. You matter, and you don't have to do this alone." The house was modest, nestled in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood where laughter still echoed between buildings, and kids rode rusted bikes past cracked sidewalks. It had peeling paint on the shutters and weeds sprouting through the garden fence. But to Henry, it was a palace. The keys jingled in his hands like a bell of freedom. He stepped onto the creaking porch and opened the front door with quiet reverence. The scent of new beginnings wafted through the air, fresh wood, paint, and something warm and earthy. The space was empty but alive with possibility, a kitchen with cabinets that closed properly, a living room with light that pooled on the hardwood floors like honey, and a second bedroom, smaller but bright, just waiting for Noah. That night he slept on the floor with a rolled-up hoodie for a pillow and a smile he couldn't wipe away. It was the first time in years he hadn't curled his body against the cold or dreamt of all he'd lost. Instead, he dreamed of spaghetti dinners, movie nights, and the sound of his son's laughter echoing through the walls. A week later, Noah stood in the doorway, duffel bag over one shoulder, taller now, older but with the same crooked grin Henry remembered from the faded photograph he kept tucked in his wallet. The reunion was quiet, no fireworks, no big speeches, just an embrace that lingered, that ached, that healed. Henry held his son and whispered, "Told you I'd come back for you." And Noah, his voice breaking with a mixture of awe and relief, said, "You kept your promise, Dad." The days that followed were filled with small, beautiful things. Burned toast on a Saturday morning. A couch too old for the living room but perfect for napping. Homework spread out on the kitchen table beside job offers and mail. They argued about dishes, laughed over frozen pizza, took turns picking songs on long drives to nowhere. Henry, once a man who had nothing but a coat and a cardboard sign of hope, now had a home, a real one, a place where family lived, where his name was on the mailbox, where Noah, still figuring life out, could fall apart and know someone would be there to help pick up the pieces. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun slip behind the city skyline, Noah turned to him. "Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" Henry's throat tightened. He reached over, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "I think she'd say we finally made it home." It started with coffee, not the kind bought in haste between meetings or gulped on sleepless nights, but the kind brewed with care, poured slowly, shared in silence, savored with presence. Claire and Henry began meeting at a small cafe tucked into a quiet corner of Brooklyn. No agendas, no titles, just two people who had come through their own storms, finding shelter in each other's company. Their conversations wandered like the slow trickle of cream into a coffee cup, gentle, warm, honest. They spoke of old dreams and new fears, of childhood stories and late-night thoughts. Henry told her about Noah's love for space documentaries. Claire spoke about her love for poetry, the kind that wasn't taught in school but lived in park benches and rain-soaked sidewalks. Over time, it became less about the coffee and more about being near each other. He made her laugh, a quiet, surprise sound that had become his favorite music. She gave him something he hadn't felt in years, certainty. One autumn afternoon, Claire stood in the Infinity Group's rooftop garden, her arms wrapped in a shawl, gazing at the city as golden light spilled across the skyline. The wind danced with her hair, and when Henry stepped behind her, she didn't turn. She just smiled. He cleared his throat. "You ever think," he said softly, "that we're all just waiting for someone to see us, not for what we've lost or what we've built, but for who we are when no one's looking?" She turned to face him, her eyes glistening. "I see you, Henry Miles. Always have." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. It wasn't velvet. It wasn't new, but it had been held in his palm so many times the corners were worn smooth. "I carried this around for a long time. Told myself I'd wait until the timing felt right. But I've learned something from you, Claire. Love doesn't wait for perfection. It just shows up." He opened the box. Inside, nestled in a soft cloth, was a silver ring. Simple, strong, timeless. Henry's voice trembled as he knelt. "Claire Langston, You gave me back my name, my hope, my family. You saw the man I thought the world had forgotten. Will you marry me? Claire laughed, her voice breaking like sunlight through clouds. She knelt with him, cupping his weathered hands in her own. You gave me something too, she whispered. A reason to believe in people again. A reason to believe in love again. She kissed him softly, sweetly, like a promise. Yes, she said through joyful tears. Yes, Henry, 1,000 times yes. The day of their wedding dawned not with grandeur, but with gentle warmth, like the kind of light that slowly fills a room just before sunrise, soft and golden and full of promise. It wasn't held at a luxury resort or an ivy-wrapped chapel. It didn't need to be. Claire had chosen Thomas's place, a red brick community center nestled on a quiet street, its hand-painted sign slightly faded by time, but the heart behind it brighter than ever. It was here that Claire had first been shown kindness. It was here that Henry had remembered what kindness could build. Inside, children strung garlands of construction, paper hearts, and daisies across the ceiling. The folding chairs didn't match. The tablecloths were wrinkled. The flowers were wild-picked. And yet, somehow, it was perfect, because everything in that room had been touched by love. The guests were not CEOs or media moguls. They were shelter volunteers, social workers, single mothers, janitors, interns from Henry's mentorship program, old friends from Claire's journey, and quiet strangers who'd once received help when they needed it most. No one arrived in limousines. Some came by foot, some by subway, but all came with hearts wide open. Claire wore a simple white dress. Her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders. She held a bouquet wrapped in a strip of Henry's old jacket. Just a small piece of the coat that had once started it all. Henry stood at the altar, Noah at his side as best man, his hands steady for the first time in a long time. He wore the same suit from Claire's awards ceremony, pressed with care, every thread now full of memory. When the doors opened and Claire stepped in, a hush fell over the room. Not because of her beauty, though it radiated from her like morning sun, but because of what she represented: resilience, redemption. A woman who had once been invisible, now walking toward a man who had once been forgotten. They met in the middle of the aisle. Neither rushed. Their fingers reached out, found each other, and held like a lifeline. In a voice clear and unwavering, Claire spoke her vows. Once, you gave me your coat, and it changed my life. Tonight, I give you something more: my love, my loyalty, my heart. You reminded me that kindness isn't weakness, that love isn't earned by wealth, and that some of the greatest things in life are quiet and freely given. Henry's voice cracked with emotion as he replied, You gave me back my name, my family, my future. I was a man who had lost everything. But then I met you. You saw me. You didn't look away. And now I vow to see you, to choose you every day of my life. Not because I need to, but because I want to. Because you are my home. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, the room erupted in applause, in cheers, in tears. Even the string lights seemed to glow brighter. Later that evening, the reception spilled out into the courtyard. Children ran barefoot across the grass. Paper lanterns bobbed in the breeze. Someone played a guitar softly under a tree, while laughter and clinking glasses filled the air. No one cared about five-star meals or champagne fountains. The cake had been baked by a 19-year-old culinary student Henry had mentored. The favors were handwritten notes from Claire herself, each one a quote about love. On one easel stood a framed photograph of the jacket, frayed and sacred, beside a plaque that read, One small act of kindness can rewrite a life. Beside it, another photo. Claire with her head resting on Henry's shoulder, both of them smiling, not the kind of smile for cameras, but the kind you wear when your soul is at peace. The Monday after their wedding, Henry didn't take a honeymoon flight to the Maldives or sip champagne under a palm tree. Instead, he walked through the front doors of Infinity Group, hand in hand with Claire, a soft smile on his face and something new in his step. Belonging. He wasn't the janitor, the intern, or a charity case. He was Henry Miles, husband, father, advisor, mentor. A man whose title wasn't just printed on a business card, but etched into the hearts of everyone he met. His office was small, cozy, tucked away in a quiet wing of the building. No glass walls, no chrome. Just warm light, secondhand books, a coffee pot that never ran dry, and a soft couch where people came not for performance reviews, but peace. People came for his stories, for his steady gaze, for the way he made them feel seen. They came when they were burnt out, when they were struggling to balance motherhood with meetings, when they didn't feel good enough despite the six-figure paycheck. And Henry listened, not with a clock in mind or a solution in hand, but with presence. A junior analyst once walked into his office with tears in her eyes. "I don't think I'm cut out for this," she whispered. Henry looked at her gently. "Why?" "Because I'm tired. I mess up. I freeze in meetings. I don't belong." He stood and poured her a warm mug of coffee. Then he sat down beside her and said something she never forgot. "Tired doesn't mean you're broken. It means you've been carrying something heavy, probably longer than anyone knows, but you're still here." That's strength, not failure. By the end of the day, that quote was taped to break room walls, added to email signatures, and printed on mugs gifted to new hires. Not because it came from a CEO, but because it came from Henry. Outside of work, life blossomed slowly and sweetly. Their home in Brooklyn was small but filled with laughter. With Sunday pancakes, the hum of jazz on old records, and Claire's quiet humming in the kitchen while Henry tinkered in the garden. Noah often came home from college, filling the house with stories and music. He brought friends too, kids who didn't know what a safe home felt like until they stepped through Henry's door. One night, while sitting on the porch swing beside Claire, Henry whispered, "I don't think I've ever been this happy." She rested her head on his shoulder and replied, "You haven't just changed this company, Henry. You've changed the way I see the world." 1 year after their wedding, Claire hosted Infinity Group's first day of kindness. The atrium was transformed. No banners for profits or performance. Just fairy lights, laughter, and a wall where employees wrote about the person whose kindness had changed them. At the center stood the coat, framed, protected, revered, and beside it a plaque. In memory of the night everything changed, because one man gave all he had left, and in doing so, gave everything. Their story became legend, not because they were perfect, but because they were proof that even the smallest act can rewrite an entire life. From a bus stop in the snow, to a wedding in a community center, to a movement that changed how people treat each other. Years passed, and the city moved on as cities do. Glass towers rose higher, the skyline shifted, and faces changed. But in one quiet room on the fifth floor of Infinity Group, a weathered coat still hung behind glass. Visitors often asked about it. Some assumed it was symbolic, a tribute to hard times or a nod to humble beginnings. But the employees knew better. They knew the story. They had heard it whispered in elevator rides, shared over coffee, told to new hires with a reverence usually reserved for legends. And every version ended the same way. He gave her his coat, and she gave him a second chance. Henry and Claire never sought the spotlight. They built a life grounded not in wealth or accolades, but in purpose. They adopted a little girl from the foster system Claire once called home. They opened a second Thomas's Place in another neighborhood, naming the reading room after Noah. And every winter, on the anniversary of that snowy night, they stood together beneath the street lamp at 56th and Madison, handing out coats, coffee, and hope. No cameras, no speeches, just warmth. One evening, a woman in line pulled Henry aside. "I lost my job last month," she said. "I didn't think I could keep going. But someone told me about this couple, about you, about how kindness saved your life." Her voice trembled. "Do you think it could save mine too?" Henry smiled softly, wrapping a coat around her shoulders, just like he had all those years ago. "I think it already has." Legacy doesn't always come from empire building. Sometimes it comes from giving, from showing up, from standing in the cold beside someone who has nothing, and giving what little you have left. Henry never built another skyscraper, but he built something greater. He built people. He built courage. He built kindness, brick by invisible brick, in the hearts of everyone who crossed his path. And Claire? She had always been a woman of power, but now she wielded a different kind. The power of empathy, of seeing others, of leading with instead of hierarchy. In boardrooms, she quoted Henry more than any business book. In meetings, she asked not just for strategy, but for soul. On the final page of Henry's old notebook, the one he once scribbled job leads and interview tips in, there was a line written in ink, slightly smudged from time. Sometimes the smallest acts, like giving away your coat, can warm more than just one person. They can warm the whole world. And so, dear listener, if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever believed you had nothing left to offer, if you've ever wondered whether your small kindness mattered, remember this: a man once gave away a coat, and in doing so he found a home, a family, and a love that would last forever.